Hello and welcome back to this exciting series of tutorials on the Django REST framework. Get ready for part 2. In this tutorial, we're going to go ahead and make the Django REST framework, the API we used and developed using Django REST framework. We're going to go ahead and make it come to life. So first we were adding things from the admin. Now we're going to make something for the client to actually go ahead and interact with our API. Let's get started. So in this lesson, we're going to go ahead and make everything work in the views and URLs. Let's get rolling. So I'm going to go ahead over to VS Code, and we left off last time at models and serializers. So a little bit of a recap on these two. Models are going to be our model classes. So they define the data models, which will then be migrated, or you can say transferred into SQL to build our database. And then we're also going to have the serializers, which will handle transporting data from the client to the database and the database to the client. Now it's time to head on over to the views, and serializers and models will be working together within the views.py file. And if you didn't watch the previous tutorial, I highly recommend you watch the previous tutorial to go ahead and get a glimpse of what these two files are for. And also how you're going to set up the API project itself. So without further delay, let's get started. Here I am at views, and you can just remove this render import since we're not going to need it. We're going to import a few things. We're going to first go ahead and say from REST framework dot generics import list create API view. Then we're going to say from REST framework dot response import response. And in a moment, I'm going to go over what each and everything means. Next, we're going to go ahead and say from dot import serializers. And then finally, we're going to say from dot import models. So models and serializers, we already know why those are there. Now, what about the list create API view and response? Well, these are classes which we are importing, and we are going to inherit them and utilize them to make the client-side logic. So the whole battleground is right here on what's going to happen. So how data is going to be sent to the database, how it's going to be retrieved, all that Shazam will happen here. And surprisingly, since Django REST framework is such a hybrid and a hybrid type of framework which can be used to develop apps before a deadline, we are going to make our view in just 3 lines of code. Yes, you heard me right, 3 lines of code. And be sure to subscribe to Ideations Tech for more exciting tutorials. And be sure to hit the like button and subscribe button. So list create API view is something we're going to inherit, and this is a pre-built piece of code which Django gives us, the Django REST framework, to go ahead and make our view. So the logical part, which handles listing data and creating data, as the name suggests. And the next thing is response. Response is going to go ahead and handle rendering the response in JSON. And serializers and models, we already know what those guys are here for. Well, without further delay, let's get started by making our very first view. So I'm going to go ahead and say class, and you can just call this post view. And now I'm going to inherit from list create API view. That's part 1. Now part 2 is going to be going and specifying the serializer class. So we're going to go ahead and say serializer underscore class, and this is an attribute you need to go ahead and specify. It's something coming from the list create API view class we are inheriting. So serializer class equals, and we're going to pass in serializers dot post serializer, which were the serializers that we made. And then we need to define the query set that, hey, which table or model are we querying against? So the query set will be models dot post dot objects dot all. So we want to go ahead and query from the database, from the data model that has post as its table, and we want to get all objects from it. Now, if you remember, one object is an item made up of these things. So the title, the timestamp, the content, all this, when they come together and we create something consisting of these 3 fields, that's an object. So here we're just specifying that we want objects.all. We want all the objects to show up. Okay, And literally, that's all there is. 3 lines of code. And response, we won't be needing this since list create API view does the work for us. Yes, it's that simple. And now the only thing left to do is actually give this a bit of a spark. So that comes from the URLs, the urls.py file. Now inside of this, we're going to have to import our views. So we're going to say from API import views. Since remember, this is our URLs file in the project folder, and the API has our views, so we need to say from API folder import views. Now coming down to this URL patterns list, we're going to go ahead and start saying path. So this is just a function that's used to define a path, and you can name it whatever you want. I'm just going to name mine posts slash, and now I'm going to say views dot post view dot as view. So as view is something you need to add if your view is class-based. Class-based views require you to add as view so that the URLs are treated equally. So they are going and being classified as views. So a class-based view will always have this as view function attached to it. And literally that's it. Now that we have this standing, we can go ahead and make the migration. So if you remember from our last lesson, Python 3 manage.py make migrations. Oh, wait, I have to activate my virtual environment first. And virtual environments are your isolated environments. So I'm just going to go ahead and say virtual env, venv. Then I'm going to go ahead and activate it. So I'm going to say source venv /bin/activate. And I highly recommend using something like Linux or Mac for programming frequently, due to the fact that the commands are way easier to process. With Windows, yeah, you can still work with Windows. It's not a problem. But just to keep things slick, Linux or Mac, preferred. However, it doesn't matter what OS you use. I'm just giving my personal opinion. So the next thing we're going to go ahead and do is install in our virtual environment the Django REST framework. So pip3 install Django REST framework. And that's going to go ahead and install all our dependencies that are required. All right, as you can see, it's collecting it. Great. Now that that's installed, let's go ahead and run the migration. So we'll say Python 3 manage.py make migrations. Great. And we need to say API that we are making migrations for this specific app. Awesome, that worked. And now we're going to go ahead and say Python 3 manage.py migrate. And that migrates all the data for us. And our db.sqli3 has been created, which we are going to take a look at once we go ahead to the view. So now head on over and run the server. So we'll say Python 3 manage.py run server. Okay, great. Now we can go ahead and open a new tab. So I'm just going to go ahead and open my web browser. So what we can do here is we're going to go ahead and pass in our URL. So our app should be running on the local host. So while the server is running, go ahead and say 127.0.0.1 colon 8000 slash, and the URLs we set was posts /. So let's go ahead and pass that in. So we're going to go ahead and say posts. All right, get ready to be dazzled. And look at that. How neat is that? We have this client side working, and the best part is the Django REST framework provides us with a browsable web interface, which lets us go ahead and test our API easily. So if you're the type who gets kind of tired of, let's say, using utilities to test your API or command line, then this can be a sight for sore eyes. So let's go ahead and create our first post. So my first post, and we're also going to say the content, my first content, just to keep things real. And I'm going to press post, and this all is coming from the list create API view we inherited from. So if I go ahead and run this, look at that. We have just created our first post. And look, if you take a look here, we have these HTTP request methods that are allowed. Now, since we're dealing with list create API view, then we are only allowed the get method, which is for listing the data. So if I just go ahead and refresh this, it's listing the data, and then posting for when you want to send the data to the database and then, this query set, the query set we specified goes ahead and gets us this data. So this line right here, query set equals models.post.objects.all. This will go ahead and, this is what it's doing right here. It's grabbing everything from the database and serializing it and bringing it into JSON on the client side. And so this is how you create your very first API view. Do note that before I wrap up this lesson, let's just see if our data was stored in the database. So I'm going to open the database, go to the SQLite Explorer and db.sqlite3, and if I just go into that API post table and say show table, look at that. The post came in through successful. The post was successfully saved to the database, and after being saved to the database, the query set which is being returned, that's going to be, whatever data we specify. So feel free to practice and play around with this, and I highly recommend you practice creating your own views and models and serializers. So that was it for this tutorial. I hope you all enjoyed it. Be on the lookout for more exciting tutorials coming your way. Thank you so much for watching, and happy coding.